The morning of March 15th dawned gray and heavy over Cedar Falls, Tennessee, the kind of day that made even the most optimistic folks feel like staying in bed. Thomas Mitchell stood at his kitchen window, nursing his second cup of coffee, and watching the storm clouds gather on the horizon like an army preparing for battle. At 34, Thomas had seen enough Tennessee weather to know when trouble was brewing, but nothing could have prepared him for what was coming. "Tommy, you better get moving or you're gonna be late for work," called Sarah Mitchell from her wheelchair in the living room. At 28, Sarah possessed the kind of spirit that could light up the darkest room, despite the cerebral palsy that had confined her to wheels since birth. Her voice carried the same musical quality that their father, Robert Mitchell, used to say ran in their family like a river. Thomas smiled at his sister's persistence. Ever since their father passed away 6 years ago from a heart attack and their mother succumbed to cancer just 2 years later, Thomas had been Sarah's primary caregiver. It wasn't a burden he carried reluctantly. Sarah was his world, his reason for getting up every morning and pushing through the long days at Henderson Construction Company. I'm going," Thomas replied, grabbing his worn leather jacket from the hook by the door. The jacket had belonged to his father, and even after all these years it still carried the faint scent of Old Spice cologne and sawdust. "Mrs. Patterson is coming to check on you around noon, and I'll call during lunch break." Sarah wheeled herself closer to the window, her blue eyes, so much like their father's, studying the increasingly ominous sky. "This weather's got me nervous, Tommy. Maybe you should stay home today." Thomas walked over and kissed the top of his sister's head, her auburn hair soft under his lips. "Can't afford to miss work, little bird. You know how tight things have been since the medical bills started piling up." He tried to keep his voice light, but Sarah knew him too well. She'd noticed how he'd been skipping meals, how the worry lines around his eyes had deepened, how he sometimes sat at the kitchen table late at night, staring at bills and calculator displays with the defeated expression of a man running out of options. The truth was, Thomas Mitchell was drowning. Sarah's physical therapy sessions, medications, and specialized equipment had drained their modest savings, and the insurance only covered so much. The house they'd inherited from their parents was in desperate need of repairs. The roof leaked in 3 places. The foundation had settling issues, and the heating system coughed and wheezed like an old man with pneumonia. But it was home. And more importantly, it was filled with memories of better times. As Thomas headed toward the door, his eyes fell on the old radio sitting on the kitchen counter. The same Zenith transistor radio their father had bought in 1987. Almost without thinking, he turned it on, and the familiar opening chords of "All the Gold in California" filled the room. Larry Gatlin's distinctive voice flowed through the speakers like honey over cornbread, and for a moment, Thomas was transported back to Sunday mornings when his father would make pancakes while Larry Gatlin and the Gatlin brothers played in the background. "Remember how Dad used to sing along to this?" Thomas said softly, his hand resting on the radio. Sarah's face lit up with the memory. He'd use that old wooden spoon as a microphone and dance around the kitchen like he was on stage at the Grand Ole Opry. Mom would laugh so hard she'd get tears in her eyes. Those were the golden days, when Robert Mitchell was healthy and strong, when their mother's laugh could be heard throughout the house, when the future seemed as bright and endless as a Tennessee summer. Robert had been a carpenter by trade, but a musician at heart, and he'd passed his love of country music, especially Larry Gatlin's storytelling style, down to his children like a precious family heirloom. Dad always said Larry Gatlin could tell a story in 3 minutes that most folks couldn't tell in 3 hours, Thomas mused, adjusting his work boots. Said his songs were like little movies, complete with beginning, middle, and end. And a moral to the story, Sarah added, completing their father's often repeated phrase. "Tommy, remember that old guitar of Dad's up in the attic? Maybe someday you could learn to play some of these songs." Thomas's expression grew wistful. "Someday, little bird. When things settle down and we're not living paycheck to paycheck." He glanced at his watch, 7:45 a.m. "I really do need to get going. Jim Henderson's got us starting that new subdivision over in Millfield, and you know how he gets when his crew's late." As Thomas reached for the door handle, A powerful gust of wind rattled the windows, and both siblings looked up with concern. The storm was moving faster than expected, and the sky had taken on that peculiar greenish-gray color that every Tennessean learned to fear. "Promise me you'll be careful today," Sarah said, her voice carrying an edge of worry that made Thomas pause. "I promise," he replied, though they both knew that promises couldn't control the weather. "Keep that radio on for company, and don't hesitate to call Mrs. Patterson if you need anything." Thomas kissed his sister goodbye and stepped out into the morning air, which felt heavy and electric, like the atmosphere itself was holding its breath. The 15-minute drive to the construction site took him through the heart of Cedar Falls, a town that had seen better days but still maintained the kind of small-town charm that made neighbors look out for each other. Cedar Falls had once thrived on textile manufacturing. But when the mills closed in the late 1990s, many families had to reinvent themselves. Some folks left for bigger cities, chasing opportunities that small-town Tennessee couldn't provide. Others, like the Mitchells, stayed and found ways to make it work. Thomas had started working construction right out of high school, learning the trade from older men who treated him like a son and taught him that honest work was its own reward. The construction site was buzzing with activity despite the threatening weather. Jim Henderson, a stocky man in his 50s with hands like catcher's mitts and a voice that could cut through the noise of heavy machinery, was huddled with the crew foreman, studying weather reports on his phone. "Mitchell," Henderson called out as Thomas approached. "Glad you're here. We need to get as much done as possible before this storm hits. Weather Service is talking about severe thunderstorms, possibly tornadoes." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. "How severe are we talking, boss?" "Severe enough that I'm thinking about calling it early today. But let's see how the morning goes. We've got deadlines to meet, and this project's already behind schedule." The crew worked with unusual intensity that morning, as if they could outrace the approaching storm through sheer determination. Thomas threw himself into the physical labor, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of hammering, measuring, and lifting. Construction work was honest and straightforward. You could see the results of your efforts at the end of each day, unlike so many other jobs where progress was measured in abstractions and spreadsheets. Around 10:30 a.m., the first drops of rain began to fall, fat and heavy like tears from an overcast sky. The wind picked up significantly, sending loose materials skittering across the construction site and making the portable toilets rock back and forth like ships in rough seas. Thomas's phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah. "Weather getting bad here. Mrs. Patterson came early. We're watching the Weather Channel. Be safe." He replied quickly. "Storm hitting here too. Might come home early. Love you." By 11 a.m. it was clear that the storm wasn't going to wait for them to finish their work. The rain intensified into a steady downpour, and the wind was strong enough to make working at heights dangerous. Henderson made the call to shut down for the day, and the crew began the process of securing equipment and materials. "Mitchell, you live out toward Maple Ridge, don't you?" Henderson asked as they loaded tools into the company truck. "Yeah, on Sycamore Street. Why?" Henderson frowned, consulting his phone again. "Weather Service just issued a tornado watch for that area. You might want to get home and make sure your sister's got a safe place to ride this out." Thomas felt his stomach drop. Their house was old and solid, built in the 1940s when construction meant something, but it didn't have a proper basement, just a crawl space that barely qualified as shelter. Sarah's mobility issues meant that getting her to safety would be challenging under the best circumstances. The drive home was nerve-wracking. The wind was strong enough to rock Thomas's pickup truck, and the rain was coming down in sheets that made visibility nearly impossible. Tree branches littered the road, and he had to navigate around debris that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The radio weather alerts were almost constant now, and each update seemed more ominous than the last. Tornado warning now in effect for Hamilton County. Funnel cloud spotted near Millfield. Residents advised to seek immediate shelter. Thomas pressed harder on the accelerator, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. Millfield was only 10 miles from Cedar Falls, and if the storm was moving northeast, which was typical for this time of year, it would hit his neighborhood within the hour. When he pulled into his driveway at 11:45 a.m., Mrs. Patterson's car was still there, which gave him some relief. Eleanor Patterson was a retired nurse in her 60s who lived 3 houses down and had been like a second mother to the Mitchell siblings since their parents died. If anyone would know how to keep Sarah safe during severe weather, it would be Eleanor. Thomas burst through the front door, shaking rain from his jacket. "Sarah! Mrs. Patterson, I'm home!" "In here, Tommy," Sarah called from the living room, where she and Eleanor were watching the Weather Channel, with the kind of intense focus usually reserved for championship football games. "Oh, thank goodness you're home," Eleanor said, rising from the couch. She was a small woman with silver hair and the kind of maternal instincts that made her naturally assume responsibility for anyone in need. "The weather people are saying this could be really bad, Thomas. They're talking about a significant tornado outbreak." On the television, meteorologist Jim Cantore was pointing at a radar image that looked like something out of a nightmare. A massive hook echo was bearing down on their region, with the characteristic signature that tornado spotters learned to fear. "We need to get Sarah to the bathroom," Thomas said, his training from countless tornado drills kicking in. The bathroom was the most interior room in the house, with no windows and plumbing that could provide additional structural support. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best they had. "I'm way ahead of you," Eleanor replied. "I've got blankets, water, flashlights, and Sarah's medications all ready to go. I've been through enough of these storms to know the drill." As if summoned by their conversation, the tornado sirens began wailing. That distinctive, bone-chilling sound that every resident of Tornado Alley knew by heart. The sound seemed to penetrate everything, vibrating through the floorboards and resonating in their chest cavities. "Okay, this is it," Thomas said, lifting Sarah from her wheelchair with practiced ease. She wrapped her arms around his neck, and he could feel her trembling, whether from fear or excitement, he couldn't tell. Sarah had always been fascinated by severe weather, despite its dangers. They made it to the bathroom just as the lights flickered and went out. The wind outside had risen to a howling crescendo that sounded like the breathing of some enormous, angry beast. Through the small window, high on the bathroom wall, they could see debris flying past. Pieces of roofing, lawn furniture, and things that were moving too fast to identify. "Remember that story Dad used to tell about the tornado that hit his grandfather's farm?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible over the storm's roar. She was sitting on the floor between Thomas and Eleanor, wrapped in their father's old quilt. "The one where great-grandpa's barn got picked up and set down 3 counties over, completely intact," Thomas replied, grateful for any distraction from the sound outside. "And how the chickens were still inside, just clucking away like nothing happened." "That's the one. Dad said great-grandpa always claimed those chickens laid better eggs after their adventure." Eleanor chuckled despite the circumstances. "Your father had quite an imagination, Sarah. But I suppose sometimes we need those stories to help us get through the scary times." The wind reached a crescendo that made the house shake like a leaf, and then, suddenly, there was an eerie moment of calm. Thomas knew from experience that this could mean one of 2 things. Either the storm was passing, or they were in the eye of something much worse. "Is it over?" Sarah whispered. Before Thomas could answer, the calm shattered like glass. A sound unlike anything they'd ever heard filled the air, not wind, not rain, but something that seemed to combine the roar of a freight train with the scream of 1,000 angry voices. The house began to shake violently, and they could hear the groaning and cracking of wood under impossible stress. "Get down!" Thomas shouted, throwing himself over Sarah as Eleanor huddled beside them. The quilt that had comforted generations of Mitchells now served as their only protection against whatever was coming. The sound grew impossibly loud, and then there was a tremendous crack, like the sound of the world breaking in half. The bathroom door exploded inward, and suddenly they were no longer in a room, but in the middle of a maelstrom of wind and debris. Thomas felt himself being lifted, Sarah's weight suddenly gone from beneath him, and then everything went dark. When Thomas regained consciousness, he was lying face down in what felt like mud. But when he opened his eyes, he realized he was in his own backyard, or what was left of it. The rain had stopped, and pale afternoon sunlight was filtering through gaps in the clouds. Everything was unnaturally quiet, as if the world itself was in shock. He pushed himself up on his elbows and looked around in disbelief. Where his house had stood an hour ago, there was now only a concrete foundation and a pile of debris that looked like the remains of a dozen different homes all jumbled together. Pieces of his life were scattered across the landscape. His father's tools, Sarah's favorite books, their mother's china cabinet, somehow still intact, and the old Zenith radio, somehow still playing Larry Gatlin's voice through the devastation. "Sarah!" Thomas screamed, scrambling to his feet despite the pain shooting through his left shoulder. "Sarah! Eleanor!" He began digging through the debris with his bare hands, calling their names until his voice was raw. Neighbors began appearing from all directions. Those whose homes had been spared were coming to help those who hadn't been so lucky. Cedar Falls might not have much, but it had people who looked out for each other when it mattered most. "Thomas, over here!" came a voice from behind him. He spun around to see Eleanor Patterson emerging from what had been his garage, supporting Sarah, who was conscious but clearly shaken. Both women were covered in dust and small cuts, but they were alive. Thomas ran to them and wrapped them both in a hug that threatened to crack their ribs. "I thought I'd lost you both," he said, tears streaming down his face. "I thought." "The garage protected us," Eleanor explained, her nurse's training evident as she automatically checked Sarah for injuries. "When the house started coming apart, I managed to get Sarah out there just in time. The concrete walls held." Sarah looked up at her brother with eyes that held a mixture of shock and something else. A kind of wonder that seemed inappropriate given their circumstances. "Tommy, I know this sounds crazy, but when we were in the garage, listening to everything being destroyed, I could hear Dad's radio playing. Even over all that noise, I could hear Larry Gatlin singing, 'Broken Lady.' It was like Dad was trying to tell us something." Thomas looked back toward the debris pile and realized Sarah was right. The old Zenith was still there, somehow still functioning, still playing the music their father had loved. In the midst of total destruction, that small connection to better times had survived. As the reality of their situation began to sink in, Thomas surveyed what remained of his life. The house was gone. Sarah's specialized equipment was buried somewhere in that pile of rubble. Their vehicles had been damaged beyond repair. The insurance would cover some of it, but not enough. It was never enough. But they were alive. In the grand scheme of things, that was what mattered. They were alive, and they had each other. And somehow, that would have to be enough to start over. The Red Cross emergency shelter at Cedar Falls Elementary School buzzed with the quiet desperation of people whose lives had been turned upside down in a matter of minutes. Families huddled on cots with whatever belongings they'd managed to salvage, sharing stories of survival and loss in hushed tones that somehow seemed more appropriate than normal conversation. Thomas Mitchell sat on the edge of a narrow cot, watching Sarah sleep for the first time since the tornado had torn through their neighborhood 18 hours ago. Her wheelchair, a replacement provided by the relief organization, was positioned nearby, along with a small bag containing the few items they'd been able to recover from the debris. Their father's watch, their mother's jewelry box, a photo album that had somehow survived relatively intact, and that miraculous Zenith radio. Eleanor Patterson had refused to leave them, despite having her own home to worry about. She sat in a folding chair beside Sarah's cot, dozing fitfully with the alertness of someone who'd spent decades as a caregiver. Every few minutes, she'd open her eyes to check on Sarah, a habit that Thomas found both touching and heartbreaking. "Can't sleep either." The voice belonged to Rebecca Martinez, a woman in her early 30s with kind eyes and the sort of presence that made people feel like they'd known her for years. Thomas had met her briefly during the intake process. She was a radio host at WCCF, Cedar Falls local country station, but today she was volunteering with the Red Cross, helping coordinate relief efforts. "Too much to think about," Thomas replied quietly, careful not to wake Sarah. "Every time I close my eyes, I hear that sound. Like the world was ending." Rebecca pulled up a chair and sat down, her voice gentle but professional. "I've been talking to folks all day, and that seems to be the common thread. The sound, Everyone mentions the sound. She paused, studying Thomas's face. I know you probably don't feel like talking about it right now, but I wonder if you'd be willing to share your story on the air. Sometimes when people hear about what others are going through, it motivates them to help. Thomas looked skeptical. I'm not sure what good talking about it would do. Won't bring my house back. No, but it might bring something else. Hope, maybe. Community support. Sometimes people want to help, but they don't know how or where to start. Rebecca leaned forward slightly. I've been doing radio in small towns for 8 years, Thomas, and I've learned that stories have power. They connect people. They make distant problems feel personal. Before Thomas could respond, Sarah stirred and opened her eyes. Despite everything they'd been through, her first instinct was to smile, a habit their mother had always said would serve her well in life. Good morning, sunshine, Thomas said softly, smoothing her hair back from her forehead. How are you feeling? Like I got hit by a tornado, Sarah replied with a weak grin that made both Thomas and Rebecca chuckle despite the circumstances. But I'm okay. Better than okay, actually. I'm alive, you're alive, and Mrs. Patterson is still here fussing over us like we're her own kids. Eleanor stirred at the mention of her name and opened one eye. I heard my name. Is someone talking about me? Just mentioning how lucky we are to have you, Thomas said, his voice thick with gratitude. Rebecca introduced herself to Sarah and Eleanor, explaining her dual role as radio host and volunteer. As she spoke, Thomas noticed something he'd missed the night before, the genuine warmth in her voice, the way she seemed to really listen when people talked, and the fact that she didn't have that slightly patronizing tone that so many people adopted when talking to Sarah about her disability. Rebecca was just suggesting that maybe I should tell our story on the radio, Thomas explained to Sarah, to help with relief efforts or something. Sarah's eyes lit up with interest. That's a wonderful idea. Tommy, you should definitely do it. I don't know what I'd say. Hi everyone, I lost my house and I'm broke doesn't seem like compelling radio. But that's not your whole story, Rebecca interjected gently. What about your father? What about the music you were listening to when the tornado hit? What about the fact that you've been taking care of Sarah all these years while working construction? What about the community of people who showed up to help you dig through the debris yesterday? Thomas considered this, his gaze drifting to the radio sitting on the small table beside Sarah's cot. Even now, in the middle of a disaster shelter, it seemed to emanate a kind of comfort that he associated with better times. Tell her about Dad and Larry Gatlin, Sarah encouraged. Tell her about how his music got us through losing Mom and Dad. Over the next few minutes, with Sarah filling in details and Eleanor adding her own perspective, Thomas found himself sharing the story of how country music, specifically Larry Gatlin's songs, had served as a soundtrack to both the best and worst moments of his family's life. He talked about his father's Sunday morning concerts in the kitchen, about how Broken Lady had been playing on the radio during his mother's final hospital stay, and about the strange comfort of hearing those familiar songs even as their world fell apart around them. Rebecca listened with the focused attention of someone who understood the power of personal narrative. As a radio host, she'd learned to recognize the stories that would resonate with listeners, and she could tell that Thomas Mitchell's story was exactly the kind that brought communities together. Would you be willing to tell this story on the air this morning? She asked. I'm doing a special extended show today, focusing on tornado recovery. I think people need to hear about the human side of this disaster, not just the statistics and damage reports, but the real people who are starting over from nothing. Thomas looked at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. Eleanor squeezed his shoulder in a gesture of support. Okay, he said finally. If you think it might help somehow, I'll do it. 2 hours later, Thomas found himself sitting across from Rebecca in the makeshift studio she'd set up in the school's library. WCCF's regular studio had suffered minor damage in the storm, so Rebecca had brought in portable equipment to maintain broadcast capability. The setup was simple, but professional, and Thomas was surprised by how quickly his nervousness faded once they began talking. Good morning, Cedar Falls. This is Rebecca Martinez with a special edition of Country Roads and Open Hearts. I'm here at Cedar Falls Elementary, which is serving as our temporary Red Cross shelter, and I'm joined by Thomas Mitchell, one of our neighbors whose story I think you need to hear. Rebecca had a gift for making the interview feel like a conversation between friends. She asked gentle, open-ended questions that allowed Thomas to tell his story at his own pace, and she knew when to stay silent and let the emotion in his voice speak for itself. Thomas talked about growing up in the house on Sycamore Street, about his parents' love of country music, and about how he'd become Sarah's caregiver after they lost both parents within 4 years. He described the financial struggles they'd been facing even before the tornado, and how Sarah's strength and optimism had kept him going through the darkest times. The strangest thing, Thomas said, his voice growing thoughtful, was hearing Dad's old radio still playing after everything was destroyed. Sarah and we grew up on Larry Gatlin's music. Dad used to say that Larry could tell a complete story in 3.5 minutes, with characters you cared about and a message that stayed with you long after the song ended. And is that what Larry Gatlin's music means to your family? Stories that stay with you? More than that. It's like... Thomas paused, searching for the right words. When Dad died, I remember sitting by his hospital bed, and they had the radio on. I Don't Want to Cry came on, and I just broke down. But somehow, hearing that song made me feel like Dad was still there. You know, like the music was carrying something of him that couldn't die. Rebecca leaned forward, recognizing the moment when an interview transcends mere information and becomes something deeper. And that radio is still playing? Right now, back at the shelter. Sarah insists we keep it on, says it helps her feel connected to Mom and Dad. Yesterday, when we were digging through what was left of our house, that radio was playing All the Gold in California, and for just a minute, it felt like maybe everything was going to be okay. The phone lines at WCCF lit up immediately. Rebecca had expected some response, but the volume of calls was unprecedented. People weren't just offering sympathy, they were offering concrete help. Construction workers volunteering their time, families offering temporary housing, local businesses pledging materials and supplies. But the call that changed everything came from Nashville. WCCF, this is Rebecca. Ms. Martinez, this is Janet Coleman. I work for Larry Gatlin's management company. We were listening to your show this morning, and Mr. Gatlin would like to speak with you about the family you just interviewed. Rebecca felt her heart skip a beat. I'm sorry, could you repeat that? Larry Gatlin heard the interview with Thomas Mitchell. He's very moved by the story, and he'd like to know if there's a way to help. Could you put me in touch with the family? After taking down the contact information and promising to relay the message, Rebecca sat in stunned silence for a moment. Then she grabbed her cell phone and called the elementary school. Eleanor, it's Rebecca Martinez. Is Thomas nearby? I need to speak with him immediately. When Thomas came to the phone 5 minutes later, Rebecca could barely contain her excitement. Thomas, I need you to sit down. I just got a call from Nashville. From Larry Gatlin's people. He heard the interview, and he wants to help. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Rebecca wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Are you serious? Dead serious. His manager wants to talk to you directly. Thomas, I think this could be big. Really big. An hour later, Thomas found himself on the phone with Larry Gatlin himself. The country music legend's voice was exactly what Thomas had expected. Warm, genuine, and carrying that distinctive storytelling cadence that had made him famous. Son, I want you to know that your story has touched my heart in ways I can't even begin to express, Larry said. I lost my own father when I was young, and I understand what it means to have music serve as a bridge between the past and the present. Thomas was so overwhelmed he could barely speak. Mr. Gatlin, I can't believe you're calling. Your music has meant so much to my family. Well, your family's faith in that music means the world to me. Now I want to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest. What do you need most right now? What would make the biggest difference in getting your life back on track? Thomas thought about the question carefully. There were so many things they needed: housing, Sarah's medical equipment, transportation, clothes, furniture. But underneath all of those practical concerns was something deeper. Honestly, Mr. Gatlin, what we need most is hope. A reason to believe that this isn't the end of our story, but maybe the beginning of a new chapter. Larry Gatlin was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, there was something in his voice that sounded like decision-making. Thomas, I want you to know that you and Sarah are not alone in this. I'm going to make some calls, and we're going to figure out a way to help you rebuild, not just your house, but your whole life. Can I get your permission to share your story with some other folks? People who might want to be part of making something good come out of this tragedy? Of course, Mr. Gatlin. We're grateful for any help. Don't you worry about being grateful right now, son. Just focus on taking care of that sister of yours and let the rest of us worry about the details. I'll be in touch soon. After the call ended, Thomas sat holding the phone for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. Sarah rolled her wheelchair over and took his hand. That was really him, wasn't it? Larry Gatlin actually called you. Thomas nodded, still in shock. He wants to help us, Sarah. I don't know what that means exactly, but he wants to help. Dad would be so proud, Sarah said quietly. He always said Larry Gatlin was the kind of man who understood that music was about more than entertainment, that it was about connecting people and lifting them up when they needed it most. Eleanor, who had been listening from nearby, came over and put her arms around both siblings. I have a feeling this is just the beginning, she said. Sometimes God works in mysterious ways, and sometimes he works through country music singers from Nashville. As evening fell over the disaster shelter, Thomas lay on his cot, listening to the sounds of families adjusting to their temporary circumstances. Some children were crying softly, missing their own rooms and familiar surroundings. Adults spoke in hushed tones about insurance claims and reconstruction plans. But through it all, he could hear the gentle background music from their father's radio, playing the songs that had carried them through every major moment of their lives. For the first time since the tornado, Thomas Mitchell allowed himself to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. He didn't know what Larry Gatlin had in mind, but he knew that something fundamental had changed. They were no longer facing this disaster alone. The voice that had carried hope through their darkest moments was now carrying hope in a very different, very real way. And for a family that had lost everything, that voice was beginning to sound like the start of a miracle. The construction trailer that served as Jim Henderson's mobile office was filled with the controlled chaos typical of any job site. Blueprints spread across folding tables, coffee-stained work orders pinned to corkboards, and the constant buzz of two-way radios coordinating crews across multiple projects. But this Monday morning, something was different. Jim kept glancing at his phone, waiting for a call that he still couldn't quite believe was coming. Thomas Mitchell sat across from his boss, feeling oddly out of place in clothes that didn't smell like sawdust and wearing work boots that weren't caked with mud. The past week had been a whirlwind of phone calls, meetings with insurance adjusters, and media interviews that had left him feeling like he was living someone else's life. "You sure you're ready to come back to work?" Jim asked, studying Thomas with the concerned expression of a boss who genuinely cared about his employees. "Hell, son, after everything you've been through, I'd understand if you needed more time. I need to work, Mr. Henderson. Sarah and I can't live in that shelter forever, and sitting around feeling sorry for myself isn't going to pay for her medications or put food on the table." Thomas paused, then added with a wry smile, "Besides, I'm going a little crazy listening to people tell me how brave and inspiring I am. I'm not brave. I'm just trying to survive." Jim chuckled at that. "Well, I've got plenty of work that'll make you feel normal again. We're starting the foundation work on the Riverside development today, and I could use my best framing guy to—" His phone rang, interrupting the conversation. Jim glanced at the caller ID and his eyebrows rose. "This is it, the call I told you about," he answered with his typical directness. "Henderson Construction, this is Jim." Thomas watched his boss's expression change from professional courtesy to amazement to something approaching disbelief. The conversation lasted nearly 20 minutes, with Jim mostly listening and occasionally asking clarifying questions that grew progressively more detailed. "Yes, sir, I understand. No, that won't be a problem. 2 weeks? We can definitely make that work. Yes, I'll have my best crew on it. No, sir. Thank you. This is something special." When Jim finally hung up, he stared at the phone for a long moment before looking at Thomas with an expression that mixed excitement with bewilderment. That was Larry Gatlin's people. Or more specifically, that was the project coordinator for something they're calling Operation New Foundation. "Thomas, they want to rebuild your house." Thomas felt like the air had been knocked out of his lungs. "I'm sorry, what?" "Not just rebuild it. They want to completely reconstruct it from the ground up. New foundation, modern electrical and plumbing, handicap accessibility for Sarah, storm shelter, the works. They're talking about bringing in volunteers, materials sponsors, and media coverage. It's going to be like one of those home makeover shows, except it's real and it's happening to you." The reality of what Jim was saying hit Thomas in waves. After living in the disaster shelter for a week, surviving on donated clothes and cafeteria meals, the idea of having a real home again seemed almost fantastical. "But why?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm grateful beyond words, but why us? There are dozens of families who lost homes in the tornado." Jim leaned back in his chair, consulting the notes he'd taken during the call. "According to what they told me, Larry Gatlin was so moved by your story that he couldn't stop thinking about it. He started making calls to friends in Nashville, other musicians, record executives, music industry people, and the response was overwhelming. Apparently, your interview with Rebecca Martinez has been shared all over social media. People are calling it the most heartbreaking and inspiring story to come out of the tornado coverage." Thomas shook his head in disbelief. "I still don't understand. We're just regular people." "That's exactly why it matters," Jim replied. "Look, I've been in construction for 30 years, and I've worked with a lot of different people. Rich folks who want bigger houses, developers who want cheaper buildings, government contracts that are all about politics. But this is about something real. It's about a family that's been through hell and kept their dignity intact. It's about a young man who's been taking care of his disabled sister while working construction and never once complained about his lot in life." Jim stood up and walked to the window, looking out at his crew preparing for the day's work. "You know what the coordinator told me? She said Larry Gatlin grew up poor in Texas, and he remembers what it felt like to have people look down on his family because they didn't have much. She said he's never forgotten where he came from. And when he hears about someone like you, someone who's working hard and playing by the rules and still getting kicked in the teeth by life, it reminds him why he got into music in the first place." The phone rang again, and Jim answered it with growing excitement. This call was from Rebecca Martinez at WCCF, and she had news that made the morning even more surreal. "The story's gone national," Jim announced after hanging up. "CNN picked it up, and now Good Morning America wants to do a live remote broadcast from Cedar Falls. They want to interview you and Sarah, and they want to cover the house reconstruction from start to finish." Thomas felt overwhelmed by the enormity of what was happening. "Jim, I don't know if I can handle all this attention. Sarah and we're private people. We've never been on television or anything like that. I understand your concerns, but think about what this could mean. Not just for you, but for the whole town. Cedar Falls has been struggling economically for years. This kind of positive national attention could bring in tourism, business investment, maybe even some new residents. Sometimes good things have ripple effects that go way beyond what anyone originally intended." Before Thomas could respond, there was a knock on the trailer door. Jim opened it to reveal Sarah Martinez, accompanied by Eleanor Patterson, and a woman in her 50s with professionally styled hair and the kind of polished appearance that suggested she worked in television. "Thomas," Rebecca said, her voice bubbling with excitement, "I'd like you to meet Amanda Foster from Good Morning America. She flew down from New York this morning just to meet you and Sarah." Amanda Foster stepped forward with the kind of confident smile that probably made nervous interview subjects feel more at ease. Mr. Mitchell, I can't tell you how honored I am to meet you. Your story has touched millions of people across the country, and we'd love to help tell it on a national stage. Sarah wheeled herself into the trailer with the help of Eleanor, and her eyes were bright with excitement. Unlike her brother, who seemed overwhelmed by the attention, Sarah appeared to be thriving on it. "Tommy, you should see what's happening outside," Sarah said. "There are news trucks, camera crews, and people with clipboards everywhere. Mrs. Patterson says it looks like a movie set." Amanda Foster knelt down to Sarah's eye level, a gesture that immediately impressed Thomas. "Sarah, I've been reading about your family's story, and I have to say, your strength and positive attitude are absolutely remarkable. How are you holding up with all this attention?" Sarah grinned, and Thomas recognized the expression. It was the same one she'd worn as a child when she was about to say something that would either charm or mortify the adults in the room. "Well, Ms. Foster, I figure if we're going to be famous, we might as well be famous for something good. And if all this attention helps other families who are going through what we went through, then I'm happy to be on every television show in America." Amanda Foster laughed, a genuine sound that filled the trailer. "I can already tell this is going to be a wonderful interview." Sarah, you have a gift for putting things in perspective. Over the next hour, Amanda and her crew conducted preliminary interviews with Thomas and Sarah, getting background information and preparing for the live broadcast that would take place the following morning. Thomas was surprised to discover that once he started talking, the nervousness faded, and he found himself actually enjoying the conversation. Amanda was skilled at asking questions that drew out the human elements of their story without sensationalizing the tragedy. She was particularly interested in the role that music had played in their family's life, and she asked thoughtful questions about how Larry Gatlin's songs had provided comfort during their darkest moments. "There's something about country music storytelling that seems to speak directly to the heart," Amanda observed. "Larry Gatlin's songs have a way of finding the universal truths in very personal experiences." "That's exactly what my father used to say," Thomas replied. "He'd say that a good country song could make you feel like the songwriter had been sitting in your living room, watching your life unfold. And now Larry Gatlin is essentially coming to your living room, or building you a new one," Amanda noted with a smile. "Have you had a chance to speak with him since that first phone call?" Sarah's face lit up. "He called yesterday evening, just to check on us and see how we were adjusting to all the attention. He's incredibly kind, and he has this way of talking that makes you feel like you've known him your whole life." Thomas nodded in agreement. What struck me most about him was that he seemed genuinely interested in Sarah's physical therapy needs and my work situation. He wasn't just offering charity, he was trying to understand our whole lives so he could figure out how to really help. Amanda made notes on her tablet, and Thomas could see her mind working, shaping their conversation into the kind of narrative that would resonate with a national television audience. "I understand that the reconstruction project is going to involve volunteers from all over the country," Amanda said. "How does it feel to know that complete strangers are going to come to your hometown to help rebuild your life?" Thomas considered the question carefully. "Overwhelming, if I'm being honest, but also incredibly humbling. Sarah and I have always been independent people. We've had to be, after losing our parents. The idea of accepting help on this scale is, well, it's difficult. But I'm learning that sometimes accepting help gracefully is its own kind of strength." "And Sarah, what are you most looking forward to about having a new home?" Sarah's response was immediate and heartfelt. "Having a place where Tommy and I can make new memories while honoring the old ones. The house we lost was full of our parents' presence, and I was worried that we'd lose that connection. But I think maybe this new house can be a bridge between our past and our future." After the interview, Amanda and her crew left to set up for the next day's live broadcast, and the trailer returned to its normal controlled chaos. But Thomas noticed that something had changed in the way his co-workers were looking at him. There was a new respect there, mixed with a kind of protective pride that made him feel like he truly belonged to this community of men who made their living building things that lasted. Jim Henderson pulled him aside as the crew was heading out to the job site. "Thomas, I want you to know that whatever happens with this house project, you'll always have a job here. But I also want you to think about something. This experience you're going through, dealing with media, coordinating with volunteers, managing a construction project that's being watched by the whole country, these are skills that could take your career in new directions. What do you mean? I mean, maybe this is your chance to think bigger than just swinging a hammer. You've got natural leadership abilities, you communicate well with people, and you understand construction from the ground up. Have you ever thought about starting your own company? The idea had never occurred to Thomas, but as Jim spoke, he could feel something stirring in his imagination. I don't know the first thing about running a business. Neither did I when I started Henderson Construction 25 years ago, but I knew how to build things, and I cared about doing good work for good people. The rest you can learn. Jim clapped Thomas on the shoulder. Just think about it. Sometimes life puts opportunities in front of us in the strangest ways. That evening, back at the disaster shelter, Thomas shared the day's events with Eleanor Patterson, who had become like a surrogate mother to both Mitchell siblings. She listened with the kind of focused attention that made people feel heard and understood. Your parents would be so proud, she said finally. Not just of how you've handled this tragedy, but of the young man you've become. Robert always said you had leadership potential, but I don't think even he could have imagined something like this. Sarah, who had been unusually quiet during dinner, suddenly spoke up. Tommy, I've been thinking about what that lady from Good Morning America said about country music finding universal truths in personal experiences. What about it? Well, maybe that's what's happening to us. Maybe our story is touching people because it's not really just our story. Maybe it's about everyone who's ever felt like they were fighting an uphill battle, or everyone who's ever had to start over from nothing, or everyone who's ever found strength in music when everything else fell apart. Thomas looked at his sister with renewed admiration. Despite her physical challenges, or perhaps because of them, Sarah had developed a wisdom that often left him amazed. You might be right, little bird. Maybe this whole thing is bigger than just getting our house rebuilt. I think it is, Sarah said with conviction. I think we're part of something that's going to help a lot of people feel less alone in their struggles. As they prepared for bed that night, Thomas on his narrow cot, Sarah in her bed near the window, Eleanor on a cot nearby, the sounds of the shelter seemed less intrusive than they had in previous nights. The crying children, the hushed adult conversations, the general restlessness of displacement. All of it felt temporary now, like they were all part of a story that was moving toward a better ending. Thomas lay awake thinking about Jim Henderson's suggestion about starting his own construction company, about Amanda Foster's questions about accepting help gracefully, and about Sarah's observation that their personal story might have universal significance. For the first time since the tornado, he was thinking not just about surviving, but about what kind of life he wanted to build in the aftermath of destruction. From across the room, he could hear the soft sound of their father's radio, playing late-night country classics at low volume. Larry Gatlin's voice drifted through the darkness singing, "Houston means I'm one day closer to you." And Thomas found himself thinking about journey songs, songs about leaving one place and heading toward another, about the hope that comes with movement and change. Tomorrow they would be on national television. Soon they would watch their new home rise from the foundation where their old life had been destroyed. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of a disaster shelter, Thomas Mitchell was beginning to understand that sometimes the most important rebuilding happens inside a person's heart, one decision at a time. The voice that had carried them through their darkest hours was about to carry them into a future they had never imagined possible. And for the first time since becoming his sister's caregiver, Thomas was starting to dream about what that future might look like. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon when Thomas Mitchell arrived at the empty lot on Sycamore Street that had once been his family home. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the October light had that golden quality that made everything look like a painting. But what took his breath away wasn't the natural beauty of the Tennessee morning. It was the sight of nearly 50 people already hard at work, their movements coordinated with the precision of a well-rehearsed symphony. It had been 3 weeks since Amanda Foster's Good Morning America broadcast, and the response had been beyond anything anyone could have imagined. The show had generated over 10,000 emails, hundreds of offers of help, and donations that had grown into a fund large enough to not only rebuild the Mitchell house, but to establish a disaster relief foundation for other families in similar situations. Larry Gatlin stood near what would become the front porch, wearing work clothes and a tool belt that looked like it had seen real use. At 68, he still had the bearing of a man accustomed to hard work, and he was deep in conversation with Jim Henderson about the day's construction schedule. When he saw Thomas approaching, his face broke into the kind of smile that made it clear why he'd been able to connect with audiences for 4 decades. "There's our homeowner," Larry called out, walking over to embrace Thomas with the easy warmth that had become characteristic of all their interactions. "How are you feeling about seeing your new house take shape?" Thomas looked around at the construction site, where the foundation had been poured and the framing was already beginning to rise. Volunteers worked alongside professional contractors, their efforts coordinated by a project management team that had donated their services. Material suppliers had contributed everything from lumber to fixtures, and local restaurants were providing meals for the work crews. "Overwhelmed doesn't begin to cover it," Thomas replied honestly. 3 weeks ago, Sarah and I were sleeping on cots in a disaster shelter. Today, we're watching strangers build us a house that's going to be better than anything we ever dared to dream of. Sarah rolled up in her wheelchair, her face glowing with excitement. Over the past few weeks, she had become something of a celebrity in her own right, charming everyone from construction workers to television reporters with her combination of wisdom and humor. Her positive attitude had made her the unofficial morale officer for the entire project. "Tommy, you have to come see the plans for my room," she said, practically vibrating with enthusiasm. "They've designed it so everything is accessible. The closet, the bathroom, even the windows are at the perfect height for my wheelchair. And there's going to be a roll-in shower with grab bars and everything." Larry Gatlin's expression grew thoughtful as he watched Sarah describe her future room. "You know, Sarah, when we first started planning this project, I thought we were just building a house. But I'm beginning to understand that we're doing something much more important than that." "What do you mean?" Thomas asked. "We're building independence. We're building dignity. We're building a foundation that's going to allow both of you to focus on your futures instead of just surviving day by day." Larry paused, then added with characteristic honesty, "And if I'm being completely truthful, we're also healing something in ourselves. Everyone who's volunteered on this project has told me that they're getting more out of it than they're giving." Before Thomas could respond, a commotion near the street caught their attention. A convoy of pickup trucks and equipment trailers was arriving, led by a bus that looked like it belonged to a touring country music act. The side of the bus bore the logo of the Country Music Television Network, and as it parked, a production crew began unloading cameras and sound equipment. "What's all this?" Thomas asked, feeling a familiar flutter of nervousness at the sight of more media attention. Larry grinned with the expression of someone who had been keeping a secret. "Well, CMT heard about our little project, and they wanted to document the whole process for a special program. But that's not the surprise." The bus door opened, and Thomas watched in amazement as a stream of familiar faces began emerging. There was Vince Gill with his unmistakable smile, followed by Amy Grant, then the Oak Ridge Boys, and finally, bringing up the rear with his characteristic swagger, Hank Williams Jr. "Holy!" Thomas started, then caught himself. "I can't believe this is real." Sarah's reaction was even more dramatic. She actually squealed with delight, a sound that made everyone within 50 feet turn and smile. "Tommy, that's Vince Gill, and Amy Grant. They're here to help build our house." Larry put his arm around Thomas's shoulders. "Son, when word got out in Nashville about what we were doing here, I couldn't keep the volunteers away with a stick. These folks didn't come here for publicity or photo opportunities. They came here to swing hammers and carry lumber, just like everyone else." What followed was one of the most surreal days of Thomas Mitchell's life. He found himself working alongside music legends, sharing jokes and stories while they framed walls and installed flooring. Vince Gill turned out to be surprisingly skilled with a circular saw, and Amy Grant had an impressive knowledge of electrical work that she'd learned from her father. The most surprising volunteer was Hank Jr., who had driven down from Alabama with a truck full of his own tools and a cooler full of sweet tea for the work crews. Despite his reputation as country music's ultimate rebel, he worked with the focused intensity of a man who had clearly spent time on construction sites. "People think musicians are all soft and spoiled," Hank said during a water break, wiping sweat from his forehead with a bandana. "But most of us came from working families. We know what it means to build something with your own hands." By noon, the framing for the main floor was complete, and the house was beginning to look like an actual structure rather than just an architectural plan. Thomas stood back and surveyed the progress, trying to process the fact that all of this was happening for his family. Eleanor Patterson appeared at his elbow, carrying a plate of sandwiches from the food tent that had been set up near the street. "Quite a sight, isn't it?" she said, following his gaze. "I keep expecting to wake up and find out this is all a dream," Thomas replied. 3 months ago, I was just a construction worker trying to make ends meet. Now I'm watching Vince Gill install insulation in what's going to be my living room." "Your father would have loved this," Eleanor said quietly. "Robert always said that country music was about regular people doing extraordinary things, and that the best musicians never forgot where they came from." As if summoned by their conversation, Rebecca Martinez approached with her portable recording equipment. "Thomas, would you mind if I got a few comments for the radio? People all over the country are following this story, and they want to know how you're handling all the attention." Thomas agreed, and as Rebecca set up her equipment, he found himself thinking about how much his life had changed since that first interview 3 weeks ago. The shy, overwhelmed disaster victim had been replaced by someone more confident, someone who was beginning to understand that his story had meaning beyond his own circumstances. "How does it feel to watch your new home take shape with the help of so many famous people?" Rebecca asked. Thomas considered the question carefully. "It's incredible, but what strikes me most isn't that they're famous. It's that they're here working as hard as anyone else. Larry Gatlin has been here since 6 this morning, and he's done everything from hauling lumber to mixing concrete. These folks aren't here for a photo opportunity. They're here because they genuinely care." "What do you think your parents would say if they could see this?" The question hit Thomas unexpectedly hard, and he had to pause for a moment to collect himself. "I think Dad would be amazed that his old radio led to all this. And Mom always said that when people come together with good intentions, amazing things can happen. She'd probably be in the kitchen right now, cooking for everyone and making sure no one went home hungry." Sarah rolled up just as Rebecca was finishing the interview, her face flushed with excitement and exertion. She had been working alongside the volunteers all morning, doing whatever she could from her wheelchair to contribute to the effort. "Tommy, you have to see what they're doing with the kitchen," she said breathlessly. "They're installing these cabinets that can be adjusted to different heights, so both of us can use them comfortably. And the island has a section that's wheelchair accessible, so I can help with cooking and meal prep." The kitchen had been a particular focus of the design process. The volunteers had worked with an occupational therapist to create a space that would be functional for both Thomas and Sarah, with features that promoted independence for someone with mobility challenges. It was a level of thoughtfulness that went far beyond simply building a house. It was about building a life. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas found himself working directly with Larry Gatlin on the interior framing. The country music legend had proven to be surprisingly skilled with construction work, and he had the kind of steady, methodical approach that Thomas associated with experienced craftsmen. "Can I ask you something personal?" Thomas said as they measured and cut studs for a bedroom wall. "Fire away, son. Why are you really doing this? I mean, I understand wanting to help, but this level of involvement, it's extraordinary." Larry stopped what he was doing and leaned against his sawhorse, his expression growing thoughtful. "You know, Thomas, I've been successful in the music business for a long time, and that success has given me opportunities to help people. But I've learned that the most meaningful help isn't about writing a check. It's about showing up. It's about looking someone in the eye and saying, 'Your struggles matter to me.'" He gestured toward the construction site, where volunteers were working with the kind of focused energy that comes from being part of something meaningful. Everyone here has their own reasons for being here. Some of them have lost homes to natural disasters. Some of them have struggled with caring for disabled family members. Some of them just believe that when life knocks people down, the rest of us should help them get back up. Thomas nodded, understanding on a deeper level why the project had attracted such widespread support. It's not really about us, is it? I mean, it is, but it's bigger than that. Exactly. Your story became a symbol for everyone who's ever felt overwhelmed by circumstances beyond their control. And this house is becoming a symbol for what's possible when people decide to care about each other. As evening approached and the volunteer crews began cleaning up their work areas, Thomas walked through the structure that would soon be his family's home. The walls were up, the roof was framed, and the electrical and plumbing rough-in was scheduled to begin the next day. In just one day, thanks to the coordinated efforts of dozens of people, the house had gone from foundation to structure. But more than that, Thomas was beginning to understand that he and Sarah were part of something that would outlast the construction project. The Disaster Relief Foundation that had grown out of their story was already helping other families, and the media coverage had inspired similar projects in other communities. Larry Gatlin found him standing in what would be the living room, looking out through the framed window openings toward the street where his father's radio was still playing on a makeshift table. "Penny for your thoughts," Larry said. "I was just thinking about something Sarah said the other day. She said maybe our story was really everyone's story, and maybe that's why people are responding to it the way they are. Your sister's a wise young woman." "She is. And I'm realizing that maybe this whole experience is teaching us that we're not as alone as we thought we were. Even when everything falls apart, there are people who care enough to help put it back together." Larry smiled and put his hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Son, I think you've just figured out what country music has been trying to say for the past 50 years. We're all in this together, and the best parts of life come from taking care of each other." As the sun set over Cedar Falls, Tennessee, the construction site gradually quieted. The celebrity volunteers said their goodbyes, promising to return for the dedication ceremony that was planned for the following week. The local volunteers packed up their tools and headed home to their own families. The media crews loaded their equipment and departed for their next assignments. But Thomas and Sarah lingered, sitting on the front steps of their unfinished house with Eleanor Patterson, watching the last light fade from the western sky. The old radio played softly in the background, and Larry Gatlin's voice drifted through the evening air, singing about love and loss and the enduring power of hope. "Tomorrow they start on the interior work," Eleanor said, consulting the construction schedule that had become her Bible over the past few weeks. "And next week we'll be sleeping in our own beds, in our own house," Sarah added, her voice filled with wonder. Thomas nodded, but his thoughts were already moving beyond the house itself. Jim Henderson's suggestion about starting his own construction company had been growing in his mind, and the skills he'd developed over the past month, project management, media relations, volunteer coordination, had given him new confidence in his abilities. "What are you thinking about, Tommy?" Sarah asked, recognizing the expression that meant her brother was processing something important. "I'm thinking about what comes next. After the house is finished, after the cameras go away, after life gets back to normal, whatever normal looks like now. And what do you think comes next?" Thomas looked at the house that was rising from the ashes of their old life, then at his sister, whose strength and optimism had carried them both through the darkest period they'd ever faced, then at Eleanor, whose kindness had made them feel less alone in the world. "I think we use what we've learned to help other people. I think we take all this love and support we've received and find ways to pass it forward. I think we build more than just houses. I think we build hope." As they finally headed back to the hotel room that had replaced the disaster shelter as their temporary home, Thomas realized that the scared, overwhelmed man who had emerged from the tornado debris was gone. In his place was someone who understood that miracles don't just happen. They're built, one act of kindness at a time, by ordinary people who decide to do extraordinary things for each other. The house on Sycamore Street was almost complete, but the real construction project, Rebuilding their lives and finding their purpose was just beginning. And with Larry Gatlin's voice providing the soundtrack and an entire community providing the support, Thomas Mitchell was ready to build something that would last for generations. The morning of November 15th dawned clear and bright over Cedar Falls, with the kind of crisp autumn air that made the Tennessee hills look like they were painted in watercolors. Thomas Mitchell stood at the window of his hotel room, looking out toward Sycamore Street where crews were putting the finishing touches on the house that had consumed their lives for the past 6 weeks. Today was Dedication Day, the culmination of a project that had grown from a simple act of kindness into a nationwide symbol of community spirit and the power of music to bring people together. In just a few hours, Thomas and Sarah would walk through the front door of their new home for the first time, with Larry Gatlin, hundreds of volunteers, and a national television audience watching. But first, there was something Thomas needed to do alone. He slipped out of the hotel before Sarah woke up and drove through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls to the cemetery where his parents were buried. Robert and Helen Mitchell lay side by side under a simple granite headstone that read, "Together Forever," and Thomas had made it a habit to visit them whenever he needed clarity or comfort. The cemetery was peaceful in the early morning light, with dew still clinging to the grass, and the only sound coming from the distant humming of traffic on the highway. Thomas sat cross-legged beside his parents' graves, something he'd done since he was a child, and began talking to them in the conversational tone he'd always used when seeking their guidance. "Well, Mom and Dad, today's the big day," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "In a few hours, Sarah and I are going to have a real home again. Not just any home, but something better than we ever dreamed possible." He paused, watching a red cardinal land on the headstone, the same bird that seemed to appear whenever he visited, as if his mother was sending a sign that she was listening. "I know you can't believe what's happened to us. 6 weeks ago, we lost everything in that tornado. I was scared, Dad. Really scared. I didn't know how I was going to take care of Sarah, how we were going to rebuild, how we were going to survive. But then, Larry Gatlin heard our story on the radio, and everything changed." Thomas pulled the folded newspaper clipping from his pocket, the article from USA Today that had run the previous week, featuring a photo of the nearly completed house, and the headline, "Country Music Legend Leads Community in Rebuilding Family's Life." "Look at this, Mom. We're in USA Today. Can you believe that? Your son and daughter are famous." He laughed softly at the absurdity of it. "But it's not the fame that matters. It's what the fame made possible. Sarah's going to have a house that's designed specifically for her needs. She'll be able to be completely independent, cooking, cleaning, everything. And me, well, I'm starting my own construction company. Jim Henderson is going to help me get started, and I've already got 3 contracts lined up." The cardinal tilted its head, as if listening intently to every word. "I keep thinking about that old radio, Dad. Your Zenith that somehow kept playing even after the tornado destroyed everything else. Sarah says it was you, telling us not to give up. I don't know if I believe in that kind of thing, but I do know that Larry Gatlin's music carried us through our darkest time, just like it always had." Thomas stood up and placed a small bouquet of wildflowers on each grave, flowers he'd picked from the meadow behind their new house, where Sarah planned to create a garden in their mother's memory. "I want you to know that we haven't forgotten where we came from or the values you taught us. All this attention, all this help we've received, we're going to use it to help other people. The Disaster Relief Foundation is already working on 3 other houses, and we're planning to expand nationwide. We're going to make sure that no family has to face what we faced alone." As he prepared to leave, Thomas noticed someone walking toward him across the cemetery grounds. It was Larry Gatlin, carrying his own small bouquet and wearing the kind of peaceful expression that comes with early morning solitude. "I hope you don't mind the company," Larry said as he approached. "I wanted to pay my respects to your parents before the ceremony today. From everything you and Sarah have told me about them, they sound like remarkable people." Thomas was touched by the gesture. "They would have loved meeting you, Mr. Gatlin. Dad especially. He was your biggest fan." Larry knelt beside the headstone and placed his flowers next to Thomas's. "Please, call me Larry." After everything we've been through together, I think we're past formalities." He stood up and brushed the dirt from his knees. "I've been thinking a lot about your parents lately, trying to imagine what kind of people could raise children with your strength and character." "They were just regular folks," Thomas replied. "Dad worked construction, Mom was a school secretary. They didn't have much money, but they had each other, and they had faith that things would work out if you did right by people. That's not just regular, son. That's extraordinary. And the proof is standing right here. You and Sarah turned out to be the kind of people who inspire others to be better versions of themselves." They walked together toward their cars, the morning sun beginning to warm the autumn air. As they reached the parking area, Larry stopped and turned to Thomas with an expression that suggested he had something important to say. "Thomas, I want you to know that this experience has changed me as much as it's changed you. For the past 40 years, I've been singing songs about family, community, and the things that really matter in life. But watching you and Sarah navigate this crisis with such grace and dignity, it's reminded me why those songs matter. I think you're giving us too much credit, Larry. We just did what we had to do." "No, that's where you're wrong. You did what you chose to do. You chose to keep your dignity when life treated you unfairly. You chose to take care of your sister, even when it meant sacrificing your own dreams. You chose to be grateful for help instead of bitter about the circumstances that made help necessary. Those were choices, Thomas, and they were the right choices." By the time they arrived back at the hotel, Cedar Falls was beginning to buzz with activity. News trucks were setting up along Main Street. Volunteers were arriving to help with the final preparations, and the hotel lobby was filled with people wearing Operation New Foundation t-shirts. Sarah was waiting in the lobby, radiant in a new dress that Eleanor Patterson had helped her pick out for the occasion. Her wheelchair was decorated with ribbons and flowers, and she had the glowing expression of someone who was exactly where she wanted to be. "There you are," she exclaimed when she saw Thomas and Larry walking in together. "I was wondering where you'd disappeared to." "Just went to visit Mom and Dad," Thomas explained. "Wanted to tell them about today." Sarah's expression grew soft. "I wish they could be here to see this." "They are here," Larry said gently. "They're here in the values they taught you, in the strength they gave you, and in the love that's brought all these people together to help you rebuild your lives." The ceremony was scheduled to begin at noon, but by 11 o'clock, Sycamore Street was packed with people. The crowd included not only the volunteers who had worked on the house, but also residents from throughout Cedar Falls and visitors who had traveled from as far away as California to be part of the celebration. Rebecca Martinez was broadcasting live from the scene, her voice carrying the excitement and emotion that had characterized her coverage of the story from the beginning. "This is Rebecca Martinez reporting from Cedar Falls, Tennessee, where in just a few minutes, Thomas and Sarah Mitchell will walk into their new home for the first time. What started as a simple radio interview has become a nationwide movement, proving that music and community spirit can overcome even the worst disasters." Thomas and Sarah waited in a car at the end of the block, giving the crowd time to gather and the television crews time to get into position. Through the windshield, Thomas could see the house that had risen from the empty lot where their childhood home had been destroyed. It looked like something from a magazine: 2 stories, wrap-around porch, handicap-accessible ramp, and windows that seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight. "Are you ready for this?" Thomas asked his sister. Sarah reached over and took his hand. "I've been ready since the moment that tornado stopped spinning. This isn't just about getting a new house, Tommy. This is about proving that our story doesn't end with disaster. It begins with hope." At exactly noon, Larry Gatlin stepped up to the microphone that had been set up on the front porch. The crowd fell silent, and even the media crews stopped their chatter to listen. In the distance, church bells were ringing, as if the entire town was celebrating this moment. "Friends, neighbors, and everyone who has traveled here today," Larry began, his voice carrying the same warmth and authenticity that had made him a beloved figure in country music for 4 decades. 6 weeks ago, Thomas and Sarah Mitchell lost everything they owned to a tornado that lasted less than 3 minutes. But in the weeks that followed, they gained something that can never be destroyed. They gained the knowledge that they are not alone in this world. The crowd murmured in agreement, and Thomas could see people wiping tears from their eyes. "I want to tell you about the young man I've come to know over these past weeks," Larry continued. Thomas Mitchell is 24 years old. He's been working construction since he graduated high school, and for the past 6 years, he's been his sister's primary caregiver. He's never complained about the hand life dealt him. He's never asked for pity or charity. He's simply done what needed to be done, with dignity and grace. Larry's voice grew stronger, more passionate. And Sarah Mitchell is one of the most remarkable people I've ever met. Despite facing challenges that would defeat many people, she approaches every day with optimism, kindness, and a wisdom that puts most of us to shame. Together, these two young people represent the very best of what it means to be human. Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion as Larry continued. But this celebration isn't just about Thomas and Sarah. It's about what happens when good people decide to act on their better angels. It's about what's possible when a community comes together with a common purpose. It's about the power of music to connect us to each other and to the things that matter most. Larry paused and looked directly at Thomas and Sarah in their car. Robert and Helen Mitchell raised their children to believe in hard work, family loyalty, and the importance of helping others. Today, we honor that legacy by giving their children not just a house, but a foundation for building whatever future they choose to create. The crowd erupted in applause, and Larry gestured for Thomas and Sarah to join him on the porch. Thomas pushed Sarah's wheelchair up the ramp that dozens of volunteers had built with their own hands, and for a moment, they stood together on the threshold of their new life. Eleanor Patterson was waiting on the porch, holding an ornate key that had been specially made for the occasion. But before she could present it to Thomas, Sarah spoke up. "Before we go inside," she said, her voice clear and strong despite her emotions, "I want to say something to everyone who made this possible." The crowd quieted again, giving Sarah their complete attention. 6 weeks ago, my brother and I were two scared people who had lost everything we thought we needed to be happy. We were wrong about what we needed. What we needed was not stuff, not furniture or clothes or even a house. What we needed was hope. What we needed was community. What we needed was the knowledge that there are still good people in this world who care about strangers. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she continued. "Every person here, everyone who donated materials or money or time, everyone who shared our story or said a prayer for us, you gave us something more valuable than anything we lost in that tornado. You gave us back our faith in humanity." Thomas stepped forward, his own emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "I don't have Sarah's way with words," he began, his voice hoarse with feeling. "But I want you all to know that this house represents more than shelter for my sister and me. It represents the very best of what people can accomplish when they work together for something good." He looked out at the sea of faces, construction workers who had donated their time, families who had contributed money they couldn't really afford to spare, children who had held lemonade stands to raise funds, and celebrities who had used their fame to bring attention to the cause. My father used to say that Larry Gatlin's songs were like little movies, complete with beginning, middle, and end. Well, today feels like the end of one movie and the beginning of another. The first movie was about loss and struggle. This new movie is about hope and community and the power of music to bring people together. Thomas accepted the key from Eleanor and turned to face the front door of their new home. But before he could unlock it, he had one more thing to say. "This house will always be open to anyone who needs help. The Disaster Relief Foundation that grew out of our story is going to make sure that no family faces what we faced alone. This is not just our home, it's a symbol of what's possible when people refuse to let tragedy have the last word." Thomas turned the key, and the door swung open to reveal an interior that took their breath away. The volunteers had thought of everything. Furniture that accommodated Sarah's wheelchair, family photos that had been salvaged and restored, and in the living room, a place of honor for their father's old Zenith radio. But the most touching surprise was waiting in the kitchen. There, hanging on the wall, was a framed photograph of Robert and Helen Mitchell, surrounded by sheet music from Larry Gatlin's greatest hits. Below the photo was a plaque that read, "In memory of Robert and Helen Mitchell, who raised their children to believe in the power of music, family, and community." Sarah broke down completely at the sight of her parents' memorial, and Thomas had to sit down as the full emotional weight of the moment hit him. They were home, not just in a physical sense, but in the deeper sense of being surrounded by love and support. Larry Gatlin, who had been watching from the doorway, stepped inside and picked up the old Zenith radio. "Would it be all right if I played something?" he asked. Thomas and Sarah both nodded, unable to speak. Larry tuned the radio to WCCF, where Rebecca Martinez was broadcasting live coverage of the dedication ceremony. But instead of her voice, what came through the speakers was the opening chords of All the Gold in California, performed live by Larry Gatlin himself. "I recorded this especially for today," Larry explained, as his voice filled the room through the radio speakers. "I wanted your parents' radio to be the first to play music in your new home." As the song played, the house filled with people, volunteers, neighbors, friends, and strangers who had become family. Children ran through the rooms, exploring the accessible design features. Adults marveled at the craftsmanship and attention to detail. Everyone seemed to understand that they were part of something special, something that would be remembered long after the news crews went home. Eleanor Patterson found Thomas standing in what would be his new bedroom, looking out the window toward the street where their old house had stood. "Your parents would be so proud," she said, placing her hand on his shoulder. "I keep expecting to wake up and find out this is all a dream," Thomas replied. 6 months ago, I was just trying to figure out how to pay Sarah's medical bills. Now I'm standing in a house that was built by country music stars and volunteers from all over the country. It's not a dream, Thomas. It's what happens when good people decide to take care of each other. And it's also what happens when someone like you shows the world what real character looks like." As the afternoon wore on, the celebration took on the feeling of a family reunion. Larry Gatlin organized an impromptu concert on the front porch, with volunteers and neighbors taking turns sharing songs and stories. Vince Gill showed up with his guitar, and soon there was a full musical session happening in the living room. But the most meaningful moment came when Sarah asked Thomas to bring their father's guitar down from the bedroom where it had been placed among their restored belongings. She had been secretly taking lessons during their hotel stay, working with a physical therapist who specialized in adaptive techniques for people with disabilities. "I wanted to play something for everyone who made this possible," Sarah announced, settling the guitar across her lap with the skill of someone who had been practicing intensively. What followed was a performance that left everyone in the house speechless. Sarah played and sang "Broken Lady," the Larry Gatlin song that had been playing during some of their family's most difficult moments. Her voice was clear and strong, and her guitar playing showed the kind of natural talent that her father would have recognized immediately. When she finished, the silence stretched for several seconds before Larry Gatlin began applauding, tears streaming down his face. "That was beautiful, Sarah. Absolutely beautiful. Your father would be so proud." "He is proud," Sarah replied with quiet confidence. "I can feel him here with us." As evening approached and the celebration began to wind down, Thomas found himself on the front porch with Larry Gatlin, watching the last of the volunteers pack up their equipment and head home to their own families. "What happens now?" Thomas asked. "After all this attention dies down and life gets back to normal?" Larry smiled and leaned against the porch railing. "Normal is whatever you decide to make it, son. You've got a platform now, and people who will listen to what you have to say. The question is, what do you want to say?" Thomas considered this, thinking about the construction company he was planning to start, about the disaster relief foundation that was already helping other families, and about the speaking engagements that were being offered to him and Sarah. "I want to say that there's still good in this world," Thomas replied finally. "I want to say that when life knocks you down, there are people who will help you get back up. I want to say that music and community and caring about each other, those things still matter, even in a world that seems to get more disconnected every day. Those are good things to say, Larry agreed. And you and Sarah are the perfect people to say them, because you've lived them. You've shown people what grace under pressure looks like and what it means to accept help with dignity. As the sun set over Cedar Falls, Tennessee, the house on Sycamore Street settled into its first night of providing shelter for the Mitchell family. Thomas and Sarah sat in their living room, surrounded by the gifts and letters that had poured in from around the country, listening to their father's radio play, the songs that had carried them through their journey from despair to hope. "Do you think we'll be able to handle all the responsibility that comes with this?" Sarah asked, gesturing toward the stacks of correspondence from people who wanted their help or their endorsement of various causes. "I think we'll figure it out as we go," Thomas replied, "just like we figured out everything else." "I'm glad we don't have to figure it out alone," Sarah said, smiling at her brother. "We're never going to be alone again, little bird. We've got a whole community now, a family that stretches from Cedar Falls to Nashville to places we've never even been. And we've got each other." Outside, the last of the news crews was packing up their equipment, but the story they had covered would continue long after their broadcast ended. Thomas and Sarah Mitchell had become symbols of resilience and hope, proof that ordinary people could overcome extraordinary challenges with the help of their community. But more than that, they had become part of a larger story about the power of music to connect people across all the things that usually divide them: geography, economics, fame, and circumstance. Larry Gatlin's decision to help had created ripple effects that would be felt for generations, inspiring other musicians, other communities, and other families to believe in the possibility of second chances. As Thomas turned off the lights and headed upstairs to his new bedroom, he could hear Sarah in her room, talking on the phone with Eleanor Patterson, making plans for the garden they would plant in the spring. Through the walls, he could hear the gentle sound of their father's radio, playing late-night country classics that would watch over them as they slept in their own beds, in their own home, for the first time in months. Larry Gatlin's voice drifted through the house one last time that day, singing "Houston means I'm one day closer to you." And Thomas smiled as he realized that they had finally arrived at the destination their journey had been leading toward all along. They were home, not just in the physical sense, but in the deeper sense of being exactly where they belonged, surrounded by love and supported by a community that would never let them face life's challenges alone. The tornado had taken their house, but it had also set in motion the events that brought them a home. The difference, Thomas now understood, was profound. A house was just a building, but a home was where love lived, where family gathered, and where hope took root and flourished. The voice that had carried them through their darkest hours was still singing, still offering comfort and connection, and the promise that tomorrow would be better than today. And in Cedar Falls, Tennessee, in a house built by love and dedication and the unshakable belief that good people deserve good things, Thomas and Sarah Mitchell were finally, truly home. The story that had begun with destruction had ended with construction, not just of walls and rooms and roofing, but of hope, community, and the kind of faith in humanity that made miracles possible. And somewhere in the distance, carried on the Tennessee wind, Larry Gatlin's voice continued to sing about love and loss and the enduring power of coming home.